terms of what he did with the Mexican-American War, etc. He's very interesting. But it is Jackson who made a major impact on the evolution of the presidency. Jackson is the first president about whom we can say that he was a populist. The folks who preceded him, the first 6 presidents, distinctly were not populists. They came from educated East Coast aristocracy by and large, and Jackson was a war hero with less education who had a very different point of view. He was thought of as Western, although he was from Tennessee. That was the West at the time. And he had a significant impact on how the presidency evolved and what it became. The second video we're going to see is from the Crash Course series also. You may recall that in our first session, we did a crash course about the office of the presidency. And this is a continuation of that, where we look at the office of the presidency and how powers in the presidency are defined. There are a number of topics that come up in that I want to talk about. One of the things with Zoom, by the way, is that when I'm showing a video, it is most difficult to interrupt the video and allow me to make commentary on it. So what I will end up doing is showing a complete video and then making some comments on it after we're done. I want to encourage you, by the way, through the Q&A feature that you can see at the bottom of the screen, that if you have a question on the presidents we're talking about, just type it in there, and when we get to the end of my presentation, we will have Stephanie read them, and then I will do my best to answer them. The scheduled length of this program goes as far as 3 o'clock, depending upon the number of questions that you might have. That having been said, we're going to go to John Green and his version of Crash Course World History, and he is going to talk about the age of Jackson, which is Andrew Jackson. This video goes for about 15 minutes. Give me a second and we will get this set up.
Stan, not that, Jackson. No, no, Stan, come on, seriously. No, not no, 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 no. Yes, that Jackson, Andrew Jackson. Sorry, I just had to check my collar. Right, so you'll recall that the initial democracy of the United States wasn't terribly democratic. Almost all voters were white male landowners. Disagree. That's just radically unfair. Exactly, me from the past. But between 1820 and 1850, this started to change. State legislatures lowered or else eliminated the property qualifications for voting, which allowed many more people to vote so long as they were, both white and male. Mr. Green. So I'd be in, right? Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah, me from the past. Quick privilege check. One of the reasons we study history is so that you can learn that people like you are not actually at the center of history, even though, you've been taught that. But anyway, the whole idea of owning land as a prerequisite for voting is sort of Jeffersonian. An individual who works his own land can be truly independent because he doesn't need to rely upon markets to acquire stuff or, God forbid, wages to give him money with which to buy stuff. No, he makes his own stuff, and he doesn't need anybody except for slaves and also women to make shoes and clothes and to cook food and also make children. But in light of the market revolution, the idea of excluding wage workers seemed very outdated. The idea of excluding women and non-white people, though, still quite popular. But this defining characteristic of the age of Jackson really had very little to do with Andrew Jackson himself, because by the time he became president in 1829, every state except for North Carolina, Virginia, and Rhode Island had already gotten rid of their property requirements. In fact, that's probably why he got elected. Right, so you recall that America's mostly fake victory in the War of 1812 and the subsequent collapse of the Federalist Party ushered in the era of good feelings, which was another way of saying that there was basic agreement on most domestic policies. The American system was a program of economic nationalism built on 1, federally financed internal improvements like roads and canals, what we would now call infrastructure, 2, tariffs to protect new factories and industries, and 3, a national bank that would replace the first Bank of the United States, whose charter expired in 1811. You'll never guess what we called this second bank, unless you guess that we called it the Second Bank of the United States. The main supporters of this American system were our old friend John C. Calhoun and our new friend Henry Clay. Both were Jeffersonian Republicans, which isn't surprising because that was the only political party, but it's kind of surprising because the American system had nothing to do with the agrarian republic that Jefferson had championed. But whatever, this was the era of good feelings, so we're gonna go with it. By the way, this nationalism also extended to foreign affairs. After Latin America won its independence from Spain, President Monroe made a speech proposing that Europe shouldn't try to retake colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And if they did, we would, do stuff. This so-called Monroe Doctrine also said that the U.S. would stay out of European wars. Ha 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 ha, that is hilarious. But we did live up to the other end of it. You'll remember that when the British came for the Falkland Islands, we were like, this shall not stand. Just kidding, we were like, go ahead. Right, so the last era of good feelings president was John Quincy Adams, who was quite the diplomat and expansionist. He actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine, for instance. But in fact, it turns out that all feelings were not good. There was significant disagreement over 3 main issues. First, many people felt that the federal government shouldn't invest in infrastructure. Like James Madison, who'd initially supported those bills, ended up vetoing one of them that included a big spending increase to finance roads and canals. Now, the roads and canals did get built, but in the end, most of the financing fell to the states. There were also big problems with the Second Bank of the United States, which, is why you cannot visit a branch of it these days, but we'll get to that in a minute. And lastly, there was the perennial issue of slavery. In this case, the problem started, as so many problems do, in Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri had enough people in it to become a state, but despite the fact that there were already more than 10,000 slaves there, a New York congressman named JAMES TALLMADGE made a motion to prohibit the introduction of further slaves into the proposed state. It took almost 2 years to work out the John C. Calhoun storm that blew up after this. Actually, it took more than that. It took until the end of the Civil War, basically. But in the short run, Missouri was allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine was carved out of Massachusetts to keep the balance of things. But the Missouri Compromise also said that no state admitted above the 3630 line of latitude would be allowed to have slaves, except, of course, for Missouri itself, which, as you can see, is well above the line. Anyway, this solution to westward expansion worked out magnificently, provided that you enjoy civil wars. So Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was still alive, which gives you some context for how young the nation truly was, wrote that the Missouri Compromise was, quote, like a fire bell in the night that awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union. Eventually, almost, but in the short term, it did mean the rise of political parties. So America was becoming more democratic, but if there was only one political party, that democratic spirit had nowhere to go. Fortunately, there was a tiny little magician named Martin Van Buren. They really did call him the Little Magician, by the way, also the Red Fox of Kinderhook, but we remember him as the worst-haired president. So despite having been president of the United States, Van Buren is arguably more important for having invented the Democratic Party. He was first to realize that national political parties could be a good thing. So I mentioned that Martin Van Buren was known as the Little Magician, and I know this sounds a little bit silly, but I think it's telling. You see, Van Buren was only the second American president with a well-used nickname, and the first was his immediate predecessor, Andrew Jackson, or Old Hickory. Why does this matter? Well, when you're actually having to campaign for office, as all presidential candidates did after the election of 1828, and you're trying to appeal to the newly enfranchised common man, what better way to seem like a regular guy than to have a nickname? I mean, if you think this is crazy, just think of the nicknames of some of our most popular presidents. Honest Abe, the Bull Moose, the Gipper. Even our lesser-known presidents had nicknames. Young Hickory, Handsome Frank, Old Rough and Ready, Big Steve. James Buchanan, and I am not making this up, was Old Public Functionary. Who are you gonna vote for? Oh, I think the Old Public Functionary. He seems competent. As it happens, he wasn't. So by now you're probably wondering, where does Andrew Jackson fit into all of this? When we last caught up with Jackson, he was winning the Battle of New Orleans shortly after the end of the War of 1812. He continued his bellicose ways, fighting Indians in Florida, although he was not actually authorized to do so, and became so popular from all of his Indian killing that he decided to run for president in 1824. The election of 1824 was very close, and it went to the House, where John Quincy Adams was eventually declared the winner, and Jackson denounced this as a corrupt bargain. So in 1828, Jackson ran a much more negative campaign. One of his campaign slogans was "Vote for Andrew Jackson, who can fight, not John Quincy Adams, who can write." Adams supporters responded by arguing that having a literate president wasn't such a bad thing, and also by accusing Jackson of being a murderer, which, given his frequent habit of dueling and massacring, he sort of was. So as you can see, the quality of discourse in American political campaigns has come a long way. Anyway, Jackson won. Jackson ran as the champion of the common man, and in a way he was. I mean, he had little formal schooling, and in some ways he was the archetypal self-made man. Jackson's policies defined the new Democratic Party, which had formerly been known as the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. So who were these new Democrats? Well, generally they tended to be lower to middle class men, usually farmers, who were suspicious of the widening gap between the rich and the poor that was one of the results of the market revolution. And they were particularly worried about bankers, merchants, and speculators who seemed to be getting rich without actually producing anything. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. This vision probably would have carried the day, except a new party arose in response to Jackson's election. The Whigs. No, Stan, the Whigs. Yes. The American Whigs took their name from the English Whigs, who were opposed to absolute monarchy. And the American Whigs felt that Andrew Jackson was grabbing so much power for the executive branch that he was turning himself into King Andrew. So the Whigs were big supporters of the American system and its active federal government. You know, tariffs, infrastructure, etc. Their greatest support was in the Northeast, especially from businessmen and bankers who benefited from those tariffs and the stability provided by a national bank. And they also thought the government should promote moral character, because that was necessary for a person to act as a truly independent citizen. So Jackson's policies must have been pretty egregious for them to spawn an entirely new political party. What did he actually do as president? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. Let's start with nullification. So in 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of 1828 because they were not yet in the habit of marketing their bills via naming them with funny acronyms. Jackson supported this in spite of the fact that it benefited manufacturers. The tariff raised prices on imported manufactured goods made of wool and iron, which enraged South Carolina because they'd put all their money into slavery and none into industry. So unlike Northerners, who could avoid the higher prices by manufacturing sweaters and pants and such at home, South Carolinians would have to pay more. They were so angry at this tariff of abominations that the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify it. Jackson didn't take kindly to this affront to federal power, but South Carolina persisted, and when Congress passed a new tariff in 1832, one that actually lowered the duties, the Palmetto State's government nullified it. Jackson responded by getting Congress to pass the Force Act, which authorized him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes. A full-blown crisis was averted when Congress passed a new tariff in 1833 and South Carolina relented. This smelled a bit of dictatorship, armed tax collectors and all, and helped to cement Jackson's reputation as a tyrant, at least among the Whigs. And then we have the Native Americans. Much of Jackson's reputation there was based on killing them, so it's no surprise that he supported Southern states' efforts to appropriate Indian lands and make the Indians move. This support was formalized in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which Jackson supported. The law provided funds to relocate Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminole Indians from their homes in Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. In response, these tribes adopted a novel approach and sued the government. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's actions in removing the Cherokees violated their treaties with the federal government and that they had a right to their land, to which Jackson supposedly responded by saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." So Jackson set the stage for the forced removal of the Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma, but it actually took place in the winter of 1838-1839 under Jackson's successor, Van Buren. At least 1/4 of the 18,000 Indians died on the forced march that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Boy, Thought Bubble, you do know how to end on a downer, but thank you. But Andrew Jackson also changed our banking system. Just as today, banks were very important to the industrial and mercantile development of the U.S. And at the beginning of Jackson's presidency, American banking was dominated by the Second National Bank, which you'll remember had been established by Congress as part of the American system. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. When I inevitably fail to guess the author of the mystery document, I get shocked with the shock pen. The powers, privileges, and favors bestowed upon it in the original charter by increasing the value of the stock far above its par value operated as a gratuity of many millions to its stockholders. Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. The many millions which this act proposes to bestow on the stock stockholders of the existing bank must come directly or indirectly out of the earnings of the American people. Stan, I know this one. It is not conceivable how the present stockholders can have any claim to the special favor of government. Should the bank's influence become concentrated, as it may under the operation of such an act as this, in the hands of a self-elected directory, will there not be cause to tremble for the purity of our elections? It is Andrew Jackson's veto of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Yes! So in 1832, bank leader Nicholas Biddle persuaded Congress to pass a bill extending the life of the second U.S. bank for 20 years. Jackson thought that the bank would use its money to oppose his re-election in 1836, so he vetoed that bill. In fact, the reason I knew that was from the veto message is because it talks about the bank as an instrument to subvert democracy. Jackson set himself up as a defender of the lower classes by vetoing the bank's charter. Now, Whigs took exception to the idea that the president was somehow a more democratic representative of the people than the legislature, but in the end, Jackson's view won out. He used the veto power more than any prior president, turning it into a powerful tool of policy, which it remains to this day, by the way. So the Second Bank of the U.S. expired in 1836, which meant that suddenly we had no central institution with which to control federal funds. Jackson ordered that money should be dispersed into local banks, unsurprisingly preferencing ones that were friendly to him. These so-called pet banks were another version of rewarding political supporters that Jackson liked to call rotation in office. Opponents called this tactic of awarding government offices to political favorites the spoils system. Anyway, these smaller banks proceeded to print more and more paper money because, you know, free money. Like between 1833 and 1837, the face value of banknotes in circulation rose from $10 million to $149 million, and that meant inflation. Initially, states loved all this new money that they could use to finance internal improvements, but inflation is really bad for wage workers and also eventually everyone. So all this out of control inflation, coupled with rampant land speculation, eventually led to an economic collapse, the Panic of 1837. The subsequent depression lasted until 1843, and Jackson's bank policy proved to be arguably the most disastrous fiscal policy in American history, which is really saying something. It also had a major effect on American politics because business-oriented Democrats became Whigs, and the remaining Democrats further aligned with agrarian interests, which meant slavery. So the age of Jackson was more democratic than anything that came before, and it gave us the beginnings of modern American politics. I mean, Jackson was the first president to really expand executive power and to argue that the president is the most important democratically elected official in the country. One of the things that makes Andrew Jackson's presidency so interesting and also so problematic is that he was elected via a more democratic process, but he concentrated more power in the executive in a thoroughly undemocratic way. In the end, Andrew Jackson probably was the worst American president to end up on currency, particularly given his disastrous fiscal policies. But the age of Jackson is still important. And it's worth remembering that all that stuff in American politics started out with the expansion of democracy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Ma.
Okay, I should be back now. That conversation about Jackson is important for a number of reasons. Let's just take one example. When Washington was president, he said his interpretation of the Constitution was that the legislature passed legislation. It was his job to implement the legislation. But as you heard, Jackson used the veto more than any other president up to that point. By the way, we've had some presidents since then who've used it a lot more often, including Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama have used it more than Jackson did. But the point is, Jackson had a different view. Jackson actually said in some of his speeches that it was his job to fight for the rights of the people against the legislature and against the judiciary. In other words, he was the person who represented the will of the people, which is very much a populist point of view and not something that any of the prior presidents would have said. Now, you heard from John Green that the financial policy of Jackson was disastrous, and it led to the collapse of the US economy, which unfortunately took place in 1837 when Martin Van Buren was president. It was based upon what Jackson had done, but let's go back to why Jackson did it. Jackson perceived that the Second Bank of the United States was there to help stockholders profit without bringing benefit to people. In other words, his view of the financial system was that bankers are profiteers who don't add value. That's kind of a narrow understanding, but that's what he believed, and many people supported that point of view. Why are those bankers making so much money? They're not adding any value, which made his position even more popular than had been before. You heard John Green talk about the tariff of abominations with South Carolina. Please note two things. First, when South Carolina protested against what they called the tariff of abominations, it was the first time that a U.S. state specifically said, we are considering seceding from the Union if we don't get this tariff taken care of. That had not been said before. We had states who were unhappy with decisions made in Washington, D.C. It's the first time a state said that. And Jackson was very clear. He said, no state has the right to secede. Now, we're going to fight the Civil War to prove that point, but Jackson very clearly was in support of the fact that you've joined the Union, and that's where it is that you have to stay. One thing that Jackson surprised blocked him had to do with Texas. Now, Texas isn't going to become a state until 1845, but the Alamo was fought in 1836 during Jackson's presidency, and Texas was very clearly trying to separate itself. But the president and the legislature, national legislature, could not work out an agreement on whether that's something that the U.S. should or should not be involved in. So they couldn't come up with a policy because they couldn't work an agreement. The result is we're not going to take care of that until Polk becomes president. Jackson leaves the scene. Martin Van Buren, his vice president, becomes president, and Van Buren is called by many people the most passive president we've ever had. Now, as you meet some other presidents in this program, that's kind of a large statement to say the most passive president, but pretty much that's what he did. Actually, thinking ahead, let's see, Hoover might be the next candidate for that, but we'll get to him in a couple of sessions. So Van Buren inherits the Panic of 1837. When you hear the word panic, think of it as depression, because that's what it is. We just use different terms then than we do now. And Van Buren became the first of what will be a number of presidents when confronted with a national economic malaise to say, gee, Constitution doesn't tell me that I can do anything, so I guess I shouldn't do anything. We will later find some presidents when faced with economic difficulties, and of course, Franklin Roosevelt is at the top of that list, who will say, no, the federal government's got to help out. But because Van Buren was so passive, he said, well, you know, we're just going to have to work our way through that. And he kind of waited for it to take place. While he did that, he also made a statement which is different than what previous presidents had said. Previous presidents had talked about supporting the Constitution, taking the oath of the Constitution to the Constitution and supporting what it says. But what Van Buren specifically said was that he was, and I'm going to quote, an inflexible and uncompromising opponent of every attempt on the part of Congress to abolish slavery. Now, slavery was a touchy topic. Matter of fact, for years, you couldn't even use the word slavery in the U.S. House of Representatives. It was inappropriate to even mention the topic. So although other presidents had said, well, I'm supporting the Constitution supports slavery, he was the first person to say, you know what, I am opposed to anyone even touching slavery, which is something which is going to bother the body politic for a long period of time. By the time Van Buren finished his term in office, the economy had started to correct itself, but not to the extent where he could claim that he had any role in it, and he was a one-term president. He was succeeded by William Henry Harrison. Now, Harrison shares a distinction with a few other presidents, including James Garfield, who we will get to later, where the president kind of pumped up his war record for what he did and said, see, I'm a great leader because I can kill lots of Indians or Confederates or whatever it is that I killed. I'm a great leader because of this, so elect me. So the phrase with him was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Well, Tippecanoe was a battle that Harrison certainly fought. It was part of the war against Native Americans, but it wasn't much of a victory. He nearly bungled it. He lost a lot of men, but at the very end of the day, one could nominally call him a victor, and he was the hero of Tippecanoe. Now, William Henry Harrison then had two distinctions. Number one, he gave the longest inaugural speech in history, over 2 hours. It's awful. I've read it, and it just goes on and on and on. It doesn't really say anything. While he was giving this 2 hour speech, he also caught pneumonia, and he died 31 days after entering office. So he is ranked as a former president, but in 31 days, he didn't really have much chance to do anything. So his successor, however, did do a couple of things. His successor is John Tyler. Tyler becomes the first vice president elevated to the presidency upon the president's death. Now, you might think that's kind of obvious. Why else would we have a vice president except to take over if the president dies, right? Well, the Constitution didn't actually say who became president if that took place. The general assumption was, well, maybe it should be the Secretary of State because he was generally the most important person in the cabinet, and maybe it should be him. But Tyler literally seized the office and said, why else would I have the title of vice president if I wasn't supposed to be president if the president dies? So he took it. His cabinet fought him, and his cabinet had a lot of very strong personalities in it, including Daniel Webster. And the cabinet argued, and they said, wait a minute, we were picked by the prior president, and we should have some sort of a decision-making process where we reach some sort of agreement in the cabinet for the things that you're going to do. And Tyler said, absolutely, positively not. I am the president, and if you don't like it, you can all resign. He becomes the first president in American history whose entire cabinet resigned in protest over him acting in a dictatorial monarchy-like manner. Now, you remember we just heard a few minutes ago about Jackson being called a monarch also by his detractors. Well, so was Tyler by his cabinet members, which is, he's not listening to input for us. It's as if he is a person unto himself. He strongly believed in executive primacy. He recruited a whole new cabinet, and he used the veto power even more, equal to the amount that Jackson did. He said, the executive branch is supposed to be the primary branch, and you can pass laws, but I'm the one who determines whether or not they go into law. Obviously, 2/3, they can override veto, but I'm the one who determines if they're going to go in law or not. He also becomes the first president to really actively involve himself in foreign policy. Now, we've had foreign policy before. Things have popped up, presidents have responded. But Tyler was the first one to say, I want to be involved in foreign policy. I want the United States to start reaching out in terms of its relationships with other countries. He signed a commercial treaty with China, the first US president to do so. Now, China still wasn't really opened up for commerce yet. We're talking about the early 1840s. But he's the first president to say we should actually do that. He's the first smooth as perhaps he wanted it to be. Tyler, I mentioned, was from Virginia. He was a proponent of slavery, and he has a dubious distinction after his term as president was done and the Confederacy got started. He was from Virginia, and he was elected a representative in the Confederate Congress from Virginia, where he spoke against Lincoln, he spoke against abolitionists, he lived the credo that he had, which was slavery is a good thing, and I'm going to be in support of it. And clearly that's what the founding fathers wanted, and I'm going to support my native Virginia, the Confederacy, as they fight for that. So his legacy, if you will, is a bit besmirched because of what he had chosen to do. We're now at the edge of James K. Polk. 1845 to 1849. Polk was the president who strongly believed in manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, sarcasm coming, by the way. Manifest destiny is the belief that Caucasian Americans have the right to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean and to take all of that land for themselves. And the fact that there's Native Americans there, they're kind of pesky and we get them out of the way because they're not really that important. Oh, and by the way, we are going to absolutely secure Texas, and we are going to fight the Mexican-American War because Mexico has some claims, California, New Mexico, etc. They have some claims there. Those are really getting in the way of manifest destiny. So we're just going to run over them. And we're going to wall away the Pacific, and that's manifest destiny. Polk had incredible impact on the arc of what our country does, and the Mexican-American War was fought during his presidency. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning that of our presidents that we're talking about in this session, he is the highest ranked of the presidents, holding a rank of number 14 out of 43. So with that as preamble, we are going to move over to the second of the two videos we're going to watch today. This is also from the Crash Course series, and this is going to talk about executive powers, which is important as we talk about what Polk is going to do. So give me a minute and we will pull up that video.
Powerful person in the world is he leads what's currently the most powerful nation in the world, and he can't really take credit for America's global position. Besides, there's a good case to be made that the richest man in the world is the most powerful. And if we're talking cultural influence, then who's more powerful than Kanye? According to Kanye, no one. But rather than go down the rabbit hole of power and the secret cabal that actually runs the world, let's talk about the powers of the president that are not in the Constitution, at least not literally. So the Constitution lays out a specific limited number of express powers, but the president's able to do a lot more than what the Constitution says. Express powers are sometimes called formal powers, but the president also has informal powers that do not appear within the written text of the Constitution. Sometimes the powers he has are implied by the wording of the Constitution, while sometimes they're considered inherent in the office of the presidency, which means that they flow logically from the ideas in the Constitution. A little confusing, right? Well, maybe the thought bubble can explain. Let's start easy with an expressed power, which is not the same as an espresso power, which is what I'm currently running on. The Constitution says right here in the text that the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. This also implies that he can and perhaps will lead the armed forces when the nation is at war. It also implies that he can command the Air Force, even though it only mentions the Army and Navy. So far, so good, but what about when the nation is not technically at war? Remember that the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war as a check on presidential power. But the president still has the inherent power to use troops, even when Congress hasn't actually formally declared war. Logically, if there's an immediate threat to the U.S. and Congress doesn't have the time or the opportunity to declare war, the commander-in-chief must be able to use force. So this power is said to be inherent in the office. The problem is that once you grant that the president must have the power to use troops, how do you limit him? What sorts of threats are so immediate and dangerous that the president should have free reign to send troops, other than Martian invasions or Taco Tuesday riots, obviously? If you look at most of the times America has sent troops into conflict, especially during the 20th and 21st centuries, it's been done with him acting as commander-in-chief without a formal declaration of war. We sent troops to Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and twice to Iraq without Congress declaring war. And these are just the big ones. We're not even going to talk about Grenada and Panama and all the other small interventions. So is there any check on this power? After Vietnam, Congress tried to put on the brakes by passing the War Powers Resolution, which requires the president to get authorization to use troops within 60 days of when he first commits them, or else he has to bring the troops back. This sounds like a pretty powerful check, but in practice, Congress always authorized the president to use force. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Sometimes I use force without being authorized. The president has informal powers in foreign policy, too. Formally, the Constitution says the president has the power to make treaties, receive foreign ambassadors, and appoint ambassadors and ministers. The president has developed the power to negotiate executive agreements, which are nowhere in the Constitution. Executive agreements are, well, they're agreements between the U.S. and foreign nations that look like treaties but aren't formally treaties. They can come with treats, though. Brownies, cookies, trade concessions. The most important difference between an executive agreement and a treaty is that the agreements don't need to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, but they become valid with only a majority vote in both houses. This makes them easier to pass than a formal treaty and explains why presidents prefer executive agreements to treaties. Lately, there have been some very important executive agreements, like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, that has morphed into the WTO, and the North American Free Trade Agreement, better known as NAFTA, because if it were a treaty, it would be NAFT with 2 T's, and that would be nafty. Although it isn't mentioned in the Constitution, the president is effectively the chief executive officer, or CEO, of the U.S. Where does this power come from? Formally, it's in the faithfully executed clause in the presidential oath of office, but more practically, it comes out of his power to appoint judges, ambassadors, and other ministers. Sorry, judges and ambassadors, but when it comes to executive power, it's the other ministers that matter here, because they're the cabinet secretaries and other heads of administrative agencies that make up the bulk of the government. The president chooses agency heads that agree with his policies, at least he hopes they do, so his appointments shape the political agenda. But more importantly, in appointing the ministers, the president assumes an inherent power to direct them and their agencies on how to implement laws. This makes sense. As anyone who's ever worked for a boss knows, once you're hired, you're sort of expected to know what your boss wants and to do it. This power to direct agencies on how to execute laws is enormous. It basically directs the way the government acts. The president has pretty limited formal powers over Congress. Other than convening special sessions and the veto and the State of the Union address, maybe, he can't do all that much to influence them. I mean, Congress usually meets without the president telling them to, and he almost never vetoes bills. But that doesn't mean that the president doesn't have a big informal role to play in the legislative process. The president can attempt to set the legislative agenda by making recommendations for laws that he'd like to see passed. This is sometimes called the legislative initiative, and in practice, it usually means that executive branch officials will actually draft the legislation they want and give it to Congress to refine into something they can pass. This is what happens with big agenda items like the Affordable Care Act, you may know it as Obamacare, or the Dodd-Frank Act, which, despite being named for its 2 congressional sponsors, was actually written with a lot of input from the White House. I should note here that even though it might look like the president is usurping legislative power, Congress often gives this power to the president willingly because it wants to avoid responsibility for unpopular policies. He said it. I didn't say it. He said it. Also, this is a pretty limited power for the president because he can't force Congress to pass anything even if he wrote it and says, please, 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 and because the president's ability to move the agenda decreases as his popularity decreases. There's another legislative power that the president has that is probably the most important one. He can give executive orders. These are presidential directives or rules that have the force of law. Executive orders can be overturned by actual congressional lawmaking or by Supreme Court decisions. These executive orders allow the president to circumvent the legislative process and act unilaterally. Ideally, the president and Congress should work together, but come on! Sometimes the president decides to go it alone, because they don't work together that often, these days anyway. Some really important policies have been made by executive orders, including desegregating the military and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. But executive orders may not be as durable as a law passed through the normal channels. If the next president in office disagrees with the orders a president put in place, he or she can get rid of them just as easily as his or her predecessor put them in place. The other informal power the president has is kind of obscure, but also pretty important. The president can impound the funds that Congress has appropriated for certain programs or projects if he doesn't want them implemented. More generally, under his power to execute the laws, he can order the bureaucracy to implement policies in a certain specific way, or sometimes not at all, although this can get him into trouble. There's one last inherent power I'll mention that the president currently has, and that's executive privilege. There's probably more, but no president has asserted them yet. Basically, this is the president's ability to keep information secret by claiming that it's too important to be revealed, usually for reasons of national security. There's a check on executive privilege, though. It can be overturned by a court order, as happened in the landmark Supreme Court case U.S. versus Nixon. There, the court ordered Nixon to turn over tapes of his conversations with aides that might have related to the Watergate scandal. So even though the president isn't given a ton of power in the Constitution, the president is pretty powerful. This is especially true during war, even if that war hasn't been declared. And this is a point you should remember. You should remember everything I say, but you should remember this too. Congress and the American people are usually willing to defer to the president on military matters, and the inherent powers of the commander-in-chief are enormous. Often, increased presidential power has been the result of the president seizing the initiative and expanding his own inherent or implied power. And once a president has established an implied power, the next president's very unlikely to do away with it. Oh, please, more power? No thank you. But just as often as presidents imply their own powers, Congress willingly hands over more power, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode. Thanks for watching. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with
Okay, we're back. There's a couple of important things that come out in that video, and you'll be seeing the third part of those 3 videos in our next meeting. One, they talked about the federal bureaucracy, the size of the bureaucracy, and managing the bureaucracy. Neither the first 6 presidents that we talked about, nor the 8 that we are talking about today, had much of a bureaucracy to manage. The first real explosive growth of the bureaucracy took place during the Civil War. And the argument was made at the time, that we needed more federal employees to help manage all of the details in terms of making the war successful. We will then find, as we go through other presidents, that wars often increase the size of the bureaucracy. We also will find after the Civil War that when there are challenges to the economy, that tends to make the government or the bureaucracy a bit larger also. And if there's an overlap of the two, then absolutely there tend to be increases in the size of the bureaucracy. Not quite happening yet where we are in our historical walk. So we're talking about James Polk. And we talked about the fact that he strongly believed in manifest destiny. He also, just as a parenthetical thought, he also did something very unusual among American presidents. When he campaigned for office, he said, I will only serve 1 term. I only wish to be a 1-term president. I believe that that is appropriate. That is seldom said by US presidents. Theodore Roosevelt is going to say that later, and then he's going to be very unhappy with himself for having said that. But Polk said that. And Polk finds himself then in a position where the Mexicans are disagreeing with some of his approaches on manifest destiny. We've already made Texas a state. That was in 1845, in the beginning of his presidency. And now he is trying to see how he can negotiate with Mexico to enable us to get more land. He was willing to pay for it, kind of a reverse Louisiana Purchase. He was willing to pay for it. He was willing to trade other assets for it. But eventually, Mexico didn't see why they would want to give up all of that territory, California, New Mexico, parts of Arizona, et cetera. And we end up going to war as a result. It's not a question of whether the war was a valid war or a war that we can say was justified. It was a war that we did because we wanted to expand and we wanted that territory. We also wanted to have the border with Mexico to become the Rio Grande River, which it was not at the point when the Mexican-American War started. The border was actually much closer to Houston and Dallas than it is now with the river. But Polk thought that that was absolutely justified because manifest destiny, God wants us to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean and have all of that land in between. It became very, very popular. Besides winning all of that territory in the Mexican-American War, the other unintended consequence, wars often have unintended consequences, was that the military leaders in the Mexican-American War on our side would become, in a few years, most of the leading generals in the American Civil War. Over and over again during the Civil War, we find people who served, who went through West Point together, who served in the Mexican-American War together, fighting each other during the Civil War. And of course, the most commonly known example of that is Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, who fought together in the Mexican-American War and then fought against each other during the Civil War, which was kind of a shame, but that's what they did. Zachary Taylor, who is going to be our next president, was a famous general in that war. So he, in fact, he won the Battle of Buena Vista. So that was a real battle, and he really won that battle. He's going to be elected our next president. And as a result of the war, and Winfield Scott, also who was in charge of all of our troops, is going to be an American hero. Winfield Scott is the person who is nominally in charge of the US Army at the start of the Civil War. So we win the Mexican-American War. It's not fast, takes a couple of years, but we win, we grab all that territory, Mexico signs a treaty, and now we are barreling full steam towards the West Coast. But there's an issue that we haven't resolved. As we get all of this additional territory, the remaining 1/3, we've got the eastern colonies, we've got the Louisiana Purchase, and then we've got the western part. As we rush headlong towards the West Coast, the issue now comes up, which is, wait a minute, are we going to let these territories in as free states or slave states? How exactly are we going to handle that? Because that balance becomes important. Remember that all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, trying to find a balance between slave power and free state power becomes an issue. It goes all the way back to, how do you count a slave for the census? The answer was 3/5 of a white man, by the way. So that goes all the way back to that. Well, as all of these potential states, territories originally, and then states come in, that's going to be a real issue. How are we going to handle that, or are we going to keep the balance? We still haven't figured out how to handle slavery. Zachary Taylor, the hero of the war, of the Mexican-American War, is elected president, and he spends 1 year expressing absolutely no vision at all. A whole year, no vision. He didn't talk about where he wanted the country to go or what he wanted to accomplish as president. He really had no, it's kind of strange because as a general, he was very assertive and well organized. As a president, he just kind of sat there for a year and then he died. When he died, by the way, his successor is Millard Fillmore. And Millard Fillmore is the person who gets credit for the Compromise of 1850. Now, Fillmore supported the Compromise of 1850. Taylor wasn't so sure that that piece of legislation was going to work out, but Taylor dies. And Fillmore said, nope, this is going to guarantee that America is not going to break apart in civil war. Well, we know how that turned out. Yes, it did. The Compromise of 1850, despite all of the famous people who spoke and tried to craft it, it turns out to be an awful piece of legislation. Let me explain a couple of the things that it does incorrectly. First of all, it introduces popular sovereignty. This was supported, by the way, by Illinois Senator Douglas, who would later campaign against Lincoln for president in 1860. And what Douglas said was the best thing to do as states come into the Union is to allow them to have plebiscites to vote whether they want to be a free or a slave state. Now, keep in mind that slavery is approved in the US Constitution, but states were allowed under the Compromise of 1850 to exercise popular sovereignty. That leads to what is going to be called Bloody Kansas, where in the territory of Kansas, we have two armies, literally two armies inside the state fighting each other to determine whether it should come in as a free state or as a slave state. That's because of popular sovereignty, which Douglas thought was a good idea, but what it leads to is a lot of conflicts. There also was a lot of fighting in Missouri, but Missouri was already a state. Kansas was becoming a state, and it became a bloodbath, which actually is going to extend beyond the last president that we talk about today, who is Franklin Pierce. So that is one of the bad pieces of legislation, but it also has a second component, which is just awful. The second awful component, and Fillmore supported this, was the Fugitive Slave Act. Essentially, the Fugitive Slave Act said, if there is an escaped slave from Alabama and the slave makes it up to Illinois, or where I am right now, Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and I recognize this person as a slave, I have a legal responsibility to detain him and help make sure he's returned to his master. And if I do not, I can be arrested. In other words, the Fugitive Slave Act took all of those abolitionists in the North who didn't believe in slavery, didn't own slaves, and were unhappy with the southern states for having slaves, and required that they support it. Now, many did not. The Underground Railroad was a very popular means of conveyance from the South towards Canada, but the fact is that was the law of the nation. And the Fugitive Slave Act is not going to be repealed until near the end of the Civil War. So It was a terrible piece of legislation. It was part of the compromise, however, of 1850. About the only thing that the compromise did that was positive was it said that the slave trade in Washington, D.C. was illegal. Okay, great. So in Washington, D.C., I could not go and buy a slave, but I could go elsewhere and buy a slave. But in Washington, D.C., because that's the nation's capital, it looks unsightly, you can't buy a slave. Compromise of 1850 did literally nothing in terms of being able to address the issues that were inherent in allowing slavery in our nation. Fillmore thought it was an absolutely fine idea. At the end of his term in office, no one liked him, no one supported him. He really didn't like the job that he had. And we elected the final president in this sequence, Franklin Pierce. Now, Franklin Pierce, as I mentioned earlier, is the only US president that we know for sure was an alcoholic. And it's ironic because early in his political career, he was regarded the same way that you and I remember John Kennedy. Young, handsome, erudite, popular, charismatic, all of those qualities, that's how Franklin Pierce was observed. But Pierce becomes the first president who really is affected by his family life. He and his wife had 3 children, and the first 2 children died before the age of 2, I believe. They were very young. They died. Not uncommon in those days, but still a burden to the parents. After Pierce is elected president, he and his wife and their 3rd child are coming down from New England down towards Washington, D.C. They're involved in a train accident. Train goes off the rail, many people are injured, and he and his wife observe their child being crushed in front of their eyes by part of a train car that came into where they were sitting, crushed and killed their son. So now his wife has lost 2 children as youth, and the 3rd child she watched being killed. She went into deep depression. She never came out of it. When they got to the White House, she essentially locked herself in an upstairs bedroom and seldom came out. And in the midterm of his presidency, she just left and went back home because she couldn't stand even to be reminded of the fact that she had lost 3 children. That's sad, but it also affected Pierce because he already was an alcoholic. His wife gave him some degree of stability. When she left under those circumstances, his response was he drank. And that didn't do much for him. He had no vision. He tried to please everyone, which we all know you can't do anyway, but he tried to please everyone. And when there was some sort of conflict, he would try to find something that both sides could agree to. And if they didn't, he would kind of put up his hands and back away from it. Ineffective would be a fair statement of his presidency, and his inebriation didn't help terribly much. Franklin Pierce ends the sequence of presidents that we are going to talk about, but I want to summarize for just a bit in terms of the folks that we just walked through today. The 2 people who had the most impact on the office were Andrew Jackson, partly because of what he did with the federal bank, partly because he was the first populist and how he portrayed himself as the hero of the people against the legislature and against the judiciary. And the second person who had a major impact was James K. Polk, who said, we're going to the Pacific and those Mexicans are getting in the way and we're just going to knock them out of the way. And he was unabashed in terms of saying that and in terms of acting on that, which is interesting, but he was supported. He could have easily been elected to a 2nd term, but remember, he said, nope, I want to be a 1-term president, and that's what I think is appropriate, and that's what I'm going to do. So when Franklin Pierce ends his presidency, he doesn't want to run for president again either. The next 2 presidents that we are going to meet when we do the 3rd session are interesting statistically for this reason. The president who follows Franklin Pierce is James Buchanan. And if you've been looking at that C-SPAN poll that I mentioned in our first session, everybody unanimously agrees that Buchanan is the worst former president that we have ever had. It's literally unanimous. So we're going to encounter Buchanan, who is followed by Lincoln, who is arguably the greatest president we have ever had. And they will be the next two people. When we meet next time, we're going to go through the final run-up to the Civil War, Reconstruction, which is an important part of American history that Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes all have an important role in, often misunderstood. We'll try to work our way through that because it is fascinating in terms of our national history. So Stephanie, from my point of view, this covers the material that I wanted to cover, so we can come back to Q&A questions or anything that you might have. Stephanie, I see that you are on mute.
Yes,
there you are, you're off mute
I'm here.
now.
Let me
So
start my
let's
video.
go with Q&A.
Okay, so we do have one Q&A. Would the country benefit from a national bank today?
No, because under Franklin Roosevelt, we have developed the Federal Reserve and other ways to help control our currency. So the role that Lewis Powell has now, his last name is Powell, may not be Lewis, his last name is Powell in any case, who's in charge of the Federal Reserve, is a role that helps stabilize our financial system, works against inflation, that sort of thing. So with that and the role of the Treasury Secretary, currently Steve Mnuchin, we don't really need a national bank the way we had that before now. Jerome Powell, thank you, Mary. I got the Powell right, thank you, Mary. That's one nice thing about an audience this large is that if you make the slightest stumble, people can help you out and give you the right answer. So that's a good thing. Okay, any other Q&As, folks? Aha, there's one more.
Let's see. All right. I've heard that Jackson has been compared to Trump. Your thoughts?
Okay, we've been doing this now for 63 minutes before someone mentioned the T word. Thank you, Stephanie, for bringing that up. I appreciate that. We have had, here's my answer to the question. We have had some presidents who acted in autocratic, I am the voice of the people in this position. I'm the only elected official that all the country gets to vote on. So I would say that from that perspective, Trump and Jackson are both in that category, and we will meet a couple of other presidents who are in that, including Theodore Roosevelt, who can fit into that mold as well. But in terms of the fact that Jackson was an absolute racist and misogynist, he was both, by the way, that doesn't compare. So in terms of believing that the presidency is a little more important than the other branches of government, there's some parallel there, but I wouldn't take it any further than that, no.
All right, does anybody else have any other Q&As?
Okay, then let me finish with just one closing comment. This format is excellent because we get to talk, or at least I get to talk, you get to listen. And thank goodness that Zoom and other products, because there's now a number of products on the market, are here so we can do this. I much prefer face-to-face. All of the adults that I talk to in these formats prefer face-to-face, but thank goodness we have this as a fallback. If any of you have any comments that you want to make about how we can make this format better, because presumably we will be meeting this way for a while, then just send me an email. Many of you have my email address. It is very simple. It's my last name dot my first name @gmail.com. So just send me an email, say you're in this, and you have a suggestion for what you might like to see more of or less of or whatever you want. And I can take those under advisement, share them with Annie, and we can try to make the next session even better than this one was. So that'd be my closing comment, Stephanie.
All right, awesome. So thank you so much to Gary, and thank you so much to all of you guys for taking some time this afternoon to attend this program.
Okay,
And we
we
will
will
see you next
see you.
time.
We will see you in 2 months. Bye for
All right.
now.
Bye, guys.